Okay, now that we've made some code, we're going to save our code into source control. And the way that we typically do that is to use Git, which is the most common approach to saving changes or saving code into source control. And we're also going to store our code changes in a Git repository that lives on the internet. And the one that I'm going to demonstrate with is GitHub. Please do use GitHub, and it's free to create an account, and it's free to create as many repositories, code repositories as you want in GitHub. So once you have Git installed, and please do download and install this for your computer, run the installer and pretty much just accept the defaults all the way through to ensure you have this installed on your machine. And then also please do create an account in GitHub if you do not have one there already. And once you have created such a thing, then we're going to create a new repository to store our code in. And we'll give our repository a name. I'm going to give mine a name of dating app, which is going to be taken. So I'm just going to say dating app net 8, as I'm refreshing the course for .NET 8, and this is what I'm going to use to store the code changes. Once I've got to the end, I'll update the name, so the repository name will just be dating app, but for the time being, whilst I'm saving my code changes as I'm recording the course, I'm just going to stick with this name. Please make the repository public, which means anyone on the internet can see this repository, but that does not mean that they can interact with it. You can choose who can commit changes into your source control. If you make it private, then obviously that's more secure for your code, but you wouldn't be able to share that with anyone unless you specifically gave them access. I'm going to keep mine as public, and then I'm going to select the option to create repository and not worry about any of the other choices. And once we have our code repository created, we can then go ahead and use these commands to create and initialize Git for our code base. So we're going to use git init, then we're going to commit our changes. We could add a readme, but I'm not going to do that right now. We may want to change the branch name if it's something other than main. We can do that using that command. And then we need to tell what we create where our remote repository is going to be, and that's going to be using this command. But let's just go ahead and set things up inside VS Code. So I'll just close all this stuff down, and we'll start off in the terminal and just run the commands that GitHub says we should run. So I'll open a new terminal tab for this, and inside dating app folder, the solution folder we need to do this at, if I just check the current status of Git, which will do two things: confirm that Git is available, and it will also confirm that this is currently not a Git repository, which means it doesn't have that .git folder where our code changes are going to be saved. So in order to initialize a Git repository, we run the git init command, and this will initialize an empty Git repository in this location. Now inside our folder currently we have what appears to be quite a large number of changes. And we've got our solution file, the CSproj file, but what we also have is a lot of compiler files, lots of DLLs for code that's generated by the compiler itself. Now inside our Git repository, we don't need to store code that's auto-generated by our compiler. We only want to store in our code repository the things that we've written. We don't need to save changes that can be easily recreated by the compiler. So we need to effectively exclude a lot of this stuff from our Git repository. And one of the things we can use to help us with that is something that we can get from the .NET CLI. So if I say .NET new list and take a look at what's available inside here, then we have inside this list somewhere is a .NET git ignore file, and we can create this, and it's going to automatically contain a configuration which is going to ignore all of those files that are auto-generated by the compiler. So I'll just clear this window and say .NET new git ignore and press return. That creates this file, and what we see is that our number of code changes has gone down to 17. And what that created for us, which can we see it inside Solution Explorer? We cannot. So we'd have to go to the File and Folder Explorer and then we can see our .gitignore file. And inside here we can see everything that it's excluding. Things inside the debug folder, things inside release folder, etc. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that it's going to exclude that we do not need in our source control. We only want to store things that we create, things like our user controller, inside there. Now another thing that we might want to exclude from saving into our source control is possibly this file as well, because this is going to contain our configuration, and at the moment there's nothing in our configuration we would consider to be sensitive. No API keys, no secret strings that we don't want anyone else to see on a public GitHub repository. But we might add that kind of information a bit later. So what we can do straight away is right-click the app settings.json, and we can't do it inside the file and folder view, but if we click on the version control tab over here, then we can right-click the app settings.json and we can say add to .gitignore, and that will exclude this from being saved into our source repository. So that means it's safe for us to add sensitive information inside this one should we need to a bit later on. Now, if we go back to the terminal, I'll come back to this tab because this is typically how we're going to save our changes into source control, by using the version control tab inside VS Code. But if we go back to our terminal and we type in git status once again, then we can see what branch we're working on. It says on branch main. And I believe that's the default now for Git, so that should be what you're using as well. But if you're using something else, and specifically I'm thinking about if it's using the branch name what it used to be, which was master, then that's probably going to be not viable in future. So do use this command if you need to change it to main. Mine's already set to main, so I'm going to keep it that way. And we need to then add our changes or stage our changes, then commit, change the name if we need to, and then add the remote origin. I'm going to copy this command, the get remote add origin, into my clipboard, and I'm going to use this one now and paste this in here so that when I do push my changes up to GitHub, this is the URL it's going to use. And then I can go and make use of the version control inside VS Code itself. So we've got 16 changes in my case, and if I click the plus button, because currently these are all unstaged, and to stage all of our changes we click the plus button at the top level where it says changes, and then they change to A, which means they've been added and effectively staged. And then we need to give our commits a name, and I'm going to give this a name of end of section 2 as the name of this commit, and then use the commit button, and then these now have been saved into source control. And then we can use the publish branch to publish these changes to our GitHub repository. Now the first time we do this we might need to log into GitHub. I think I'm probably already logged in, but I'm going to click the publish branch, and this goes off and our changes are saved into source control. At that point, you might need to log into GitHub to connect effectively your operating system and VS Code to GitHub. So it should come up with a prompt for you to enter your username and password. But when it comes to your password, what you might need to do is, let's go back to GitHub. When it comes to entering your password, you might need to use a token. So come into GitHub, into your developer settings for your user. And if you go into settings and you go to your developer settings down here, then there's a section here for personal access tokens. And you can create a new GitHub token, use the classic ones, and just generate a new token that gives permissions to allow you to connect to VS Code. I've got one here called VS Code token as an example, and I've just given it the repo permissions for all repo activities, and I think nothing else. And that's all you need to be able to connect that token and use that token when you authenticate to GitHub. And when it asks you for your username and password, you can use your username for GitHub, which is this one here in my case, and then use the token as the password, and that should allow you to commit your changes and publish them to GitHub. But what I should have now, if I go back to the repo that I have created and go back a few steps, then what I've got now is my code published to GitHub and available publicly, as I can see by this here. And we've got our code changes that we've made into our application. So that now brings us to the end of this section. So we'll wrap up with a short summary before we then tackle the Angular application that we'll be looking at in the next section.